It's rather difficult to work out how far the Ulster Unionist campaign was achieving any success by the summer of 1914, and that really is because of the paperwork that the historian doesn't have, which was sort of a perennial problem. The Ulster Unionists had made a large push about the issue of partition. Edward Carson had brought in the idea of 9-county partition for the historic province of Ulster in March 1914, which had essentially fallen through. The British government had pushed the idea of partition based on the county option, which Carson had rejected with the famous speech about a stay of execution for 6 years, because this was only to be temporary exclusion. So that was all in some sort of hiatus. We also are not entirely sure what was going on with the Curragh incident and where that left British policy. The action of the 50 officers of the 3rd Cavalry Brigade at the Curragh in March 1914 seems to remove any power or authority from the British government to impose Home Rule, which makes it a problem. So in many ways that could be portrayed as a victory for Ulster Unionists, although interestingly the Ulster Unionist reaction to the Curragh isn't simply one of uncelebrated joy. A lot of the speeches after it either don't talk about the incident at all, or talk about the need for Ulster volunteers to keep training and to maintain their own discipline in the face of whatever threats would be thrown at them by the government. Really, through 1914, we see drift and dither, I suppose. Other historians have perhaps been kinder about Liberal policy, but certainly Asquith's policy of wait and see was leaving everything until the final run through of the Home Rule Bill, its 3rd reading in the House of Commons, and that meant that there really weren't any negotiations worth talking about really between March 14 and up until July 1914. July is when the King calls the Buckingham Palace Conference, and this is the one that's very, very problematic for the historian, because we have no minutes kept of what's actually being agreed there. As far as anybody can make it out, the idea of 6-county partition for Ulster, for what's now the modern Northern Ireland state, was more or less agreed there by the Unionists, the Irish Unionists, by the British Liberals, by the British Conservatives, but not by John Redmond, the Irish Parliamentary Party, which is why the conference appears to have fallen apart. So it's really very hard to say where Ulster Unionist policy was going at that stage. There's also the idea that by injecting a militant element into Ulster Unionism, that Edward Carson had created a lot of problems for himself, that when they had formed the Ulster Volunteer Force in January 1913, the idea was that that would be a compliant party auxiliary, a formation that would provide support at rallies, at demonstrations, would be an impressive presence for propaganda purposes. But then there's an idea that that had taken on a sort of Frankenstein's monster quality, and certainly at the time of the Buckingham Palace Conference, Carson receives a telegram from the Fermanagh Regiment of the Ulster Volunteer Force stating 3,000 armed men determined to hold Fermanagh for the Empire. So an idea that this was very much curtailing Carson's freedom of manoeuvre. So the chances of finding a peaceful way out were looking very, very tricky. Carson himself, I think, was always committed to a parliamentary campaign and parliamentary focus. But of course, the sense is that as you got to the summer of 1914, into July, into August, that had there been a localised clash between UVF members and Irish volunteers, between British Army personnel, the UVF, that would have sucked in Ulster Unionism as a whole to a fairly damaging civil war all round. So it's very hard to say that Ulster Unionist policy was looking terribly successful, but there is a sense by some, certainly the view of Roy Jenkins in his biography of Asquith, was that Asquith was going to make concessions as you got into September, when the Home Rule Bill reached its sort of unstoppable phase in the House of Commons, and that would be from a real position of strength by the Liberals. But whether that would have been enough to appease Ulster Unionist militancy is really very hard to discern.